The modern city in the USA was crowded not only with people but also with debates that swirled in the air. Public discussions and street conversations revolved around issues of justice, equal opportunities, and how the wealth and success of some can impact the fate of others. It was a place where even the most insignificant events sparked great discussions, and Barron Trump became one of the most controversial figures. His appearance on the public stage was like a wave breaking the silence on the surface of a pond, leaving disturbance and questions in its wake. Although Barron was still young, his response to a recent interview made many talk about his views on politics, the role of family in society, and the issues ordinary citizens face. He became a figure who not only attracted attention because of his background but also for his opinions, which sometimes contradicted widely accepted beliefs. This time, when Barron went for the interview, the questions weren't just about his personal life or what he does outside of politics. This time, he answered questions about his father, about how the Trump family changed the political landscape of the country. The topic was hot, as it was impossible to ignore the perception of his family's wealth and influence on American society. "Barron," asked the journalist, "did you have the same upbringing as your father, who claimed that everyone should be self-sufficient and that poverty is a result of choice? How do you feel about such statements?" Barron paused briefly. His eyes seemed calm, but there was a depth of thought in them. He took a deep breath and began his response. "I believe that everyone has a right to their chances. But that chance is not always the same for everyone. Many don't have what I have, not because of their own fault. It's not just a matter of choice, it's a matter of how society creates opportunities for everyone." Noticing a slight tremor in his voice, the journalist continued. "But your father has repeatedly said that the government should not interfere in personal matters. How do you see that in the context of growing inequality in the country?" "It's a complicated question," Barron replied. "I think the government can help, but it can't make decisions for everyone. There are situations when help is needed, but people need to want to change their own lives." These words sparked not only conversations among journalists but also questions among the citizens who were watching the interview on television and online. They began debating politics, the power of the rich, and opportunities for ordinary people. For many, it was confirmation that Barron Trump was not just trying to avoid political questions, but was also making his position clear, one that often differed from his father's views. Barron's response became a catalyst for a serious debate. It raised questions about injustice, the political elite, and the importance of ensuring equal opportunities for all citizens. Some considered his answers wise and mature, while others felt they were too sheltered and disconnected from the reality of people facing real problems. Furthermore, the interview sparked a new wave of distrust towards the Trump family among those who felt their values contradicted the ideals of the American dream. Recently, discussions about social reforms, minimum wage, health care for all, and support for those who had lost their jobs due to economic changes had gained momentum in the country. Barron, it seemed, had no intention of making a political career for himself, but his answer placed him in the spotlight and made the public rethink their attitude towards economic and social issues. However, the more people discussed his words, the more questions arose. Was this truly just the response of a young man trying to find his own position, or could this be a warning of bigger changes awaiting the country in the future? The interview with Barron did not go unnoticed, and it quickly drew in not only political commentators but also ordinary citizens. The streets of the cities were filled with conversations where people argued about what they had heard, about the ideas expressed by the young Trump. This was more than just a discussion of politics. It was a moment when the generation of 55 and older, who had witnessed numerous political changes and economic crises, began to reflect on the future of the country. In a small town in South Carolina, where most residents worked in agriculture, retirees and older people gathered in the local cafe to share their thoughts. Among them was George, a Vietnam War veteran who had long lost faith in politicians, and Elizabeth, a former teacher now living on her pension. "Well, George, what do you think of this young Trump?" Elizabeth asked, carefully sipping her coffee. "Listen, Elizabeth, I don't know what to think. This is the same guy who was born in a luxurious estate and now tries to tell us how important it is to work for our chances. And where are these chances for us old folks, who've worked our whole lives and now can barely make ends meet?" George asked, clenching his fists. And what's with this idea that the government shouldn't interfere in personal matters? Have you ever heard of people without health insurance pulling themselves together? It's ridiculous. But he's still young, Elizabeth said, trying to be objective. Maybe he just doesn't understand how hard it is to live when you don't have access to the resources that many others do. All this talk about self-sufficiency and choice, it just doesn't work when you have nothing to start with. During this conversation, which grew more heated, the focus was not only on the question of Barron but also on deeper political contradictions affecting society as a whole. It was clear that this interview raised bigger questions that had long been in the air. And they concerned not only Barron or the Trumps but also economic and social changes that were affecting the country. Thanks to such conversations, the issues raised by Barron went beyond his family and became part of a broader discussion touching everything from healthcare for seniors to raising the minimum wage and ensuring fairness in access to education and jobs. In recent years, many, especially older generations, had begun to feel increasingly forgotten in political debates. But what comes next? Elizabeth asked again, returning to the topic. If we don't change our approach to the economy, where will the next generations work? At that moment, journalists turned back to Barron, deciding to delve even deeper into the issue, not skipping important aspects of social reforms. Barron, the journalist asked, have you heard about initiatives supporting social reforms, such as raising the minimum wage or reducing healthcare costs for retirees? How do you feel about such changes? Barron lowered his head, listening carefully to the question before responding. You know, I believe we need to pay attention to people who need help. However, the problem is that any changes require not only government support but also changes within the people themselves. We can talk about healthcare or pensions, but every person has their own story, and in reality, we can't treat everyone the same. These words once again sparked controversy. Many heard them as a detachment from the real problems faced by ordinary citizens. On the other hand, some saw potential in his response for a more objective approach to social issues. This interview became the starting point for new conversations across the country, touching on the most sensitive political issues, including medical reforms, social security for retirees, and how the wealthier classes continue to concentrate resources in their hands. But the most important unanswered question was whether a new generation of politicians, like Barron, could understand the real situation in a country where millions of people are fighting for basic needs. Now, Barron had become not only a symbol of the Trump family but also a figure who forced the country to ask important questions about its future. The interview with Barron Trump not only caught the attention of political analysts but also many older individuals who had been witnessing political changes over the years, raising the question of what lies ahead for the country. After every one of his responses, new controversial points emerged, and the discussion grew more heated, filled with emotions and deep reflections. In street cafes and on the steps of local stores, where retirees and veterans gathered, questions about economic inequality and government assistance became more and more significant. Many of them, who grew up during the Great Depression or other economic crises, were deeply concerned about what was happening in the country now. Listen, George, did you hear what he said? Asked Elizabeth, looking at the pensioner who was now sitting in her chair, hand raised to his forehead, as though trying to figure out what was really going on. Yeah, I hear it, George replied, his voice tense. But this isn't just the words of a young man who doesn't even understand what real struggle is. He's trying to pretend that everything can be solved on your own. But where's this self-sufficiency for people who have given everything to their families and their country and now can't even afford their medications? He says, we can help, but we can't solve it for everyone, but some people really have no choice. What does he expect us to do when we have nothing but broken buses at the stops and medical bills that are a month's pension? But George, we can't spend our whole lives waiting for the government to do everything for us, Elizabeth responded, though she, too, was disappointed by the lack of concrete solutions. All these social programs and reforms can't solve all the problems. People need to start changing, taking responsibility for their lives. Yes, but when your life is on the edge, when your job can't even cover the basics, George woke up, this isn't just a matter of responsibility. This is a matter of justice. Meanwhile, the interview with Barron continued, and journalists began asking even more pointed questions. Barron, you said that it's important to change society, but at what level should this change take place? Don't you think that social spending, especially for retirees and veterans who have no access to healthcare, needs to be significantly increased? And that the government should actively intervene to address these issues? Barron paused for a moment, seemingly contemplating each word. His eyes became focused, and he responded as if not wanting to reveal more than necessary. I believe that social spending is an important issue. But if we're talking about help, it's crucial that it's effective. Instead of just increasing spending, we should think about how to make the system more efficient. I understand that this is important for older people, but we also need to focus on long-term changes. And if we just allow the government to pay, it won't solve the problems. We need to create opportunities so people can help themselves. These words sparked serious conversations across the country. Many people who had heard the interview began discussing whether Barron truly understood what real need for assistance meant for those who had long lost the strength to carve out a place in the world. They returned to the question of what was more important: government support that ensures basic needs, or individual responsibility, which may be impossible for many. And here began the greatest political concern for the older generation, who saw in every political reform, at every step, a problem with maintaining basic rights and social justice. Unrest spread among those who saw their way of life clashing with a policy that seemed to overlook the real situation they were in. New movements began to emerge across the country, demanding higher minimum wages, lower healthcare costs, and increased social spending for the most vulnerable populations. At the same time, most older citizens, who knew what real work and survival struggle meant, could not agree with the ideas of self-sufficiency, as they had witnessed how often even work does not guarantee success in life. The interview with Barron Trump was becoming not just a political issue, but a true reflection of the deep divisions in society. The interview with Barron Trump, which began as a typical political discussion, quickly turned into a true political phenomenon that divided the country into two camps. Many from the older generation, who had rich experience and had witnessed all the changes, were concerned that the new generation of politicians could not understand the real needs of people who had long since run out of resources for self-sufficiency. Barron, with his ideas of self-help and the limited role of government, became a symbol of politics that, for many, seemed cold and detached. Of course, some saw potential for reforms in his words that aimed to improve the country. But for most older people, these ideas were too far removed from the reality in which they lived, where every dollar, every bit of government aid, could become a matter of survival. In a small cafe in South Carolina, where George and Elizabeth sat, the conversation didn't end even after the television interview was over. They increasingly realized that the issues raised by Barron were not only about his family or certain political figures. It was about the future of the country, about how to find a balance between individual responsibility and necessary government support. How to ensure a dignified life for those who had given everything to the country and now found themselves on the brink of poverty. Over time, the interview became not just a topic of discussion in cafes, but also the starting point for broader political debates across the country. Issues that had previously been overlooked were now part of the general discourse: social reforms, minimum wage, healthcare, pensions for the elderly. Barron Trump became a figure who not only raised questions but also forced the country to think about its own future. But this time, unlike many previous political movements, not everything depended on who would come to power. People began to feel that they themselves would have to decide which way to go. And while the new generation of politicians continued to fight for power, older generations, like George and Elizabeth, understood that their voices mattered too, not only in elections but in the very essence of reforms. And so, at the end of this interview, the country found itself at a crossroads. Could it find a new model of coexistence where every citizen, regardless of age or social status, would have the opportunity to thrive, or would everything remain as it was, with older generations once again forgotten in the shadow of economic changes? This was a question the country still didn't have an answer to. And perhaps only time would tell whether Barron, with his ideas and views, would be able to change the course for the better. Or if his words would remain just another political moment forgotten in the next storm.